New Zealand sells itself as young, a country of fjords carved clean by ice, of sheep on green hills, of a haka performed for cruise ship passengers who clap on beat and go home thinking they understand something. The brochure shows Milford Sound at sunrise and a vineyard in Marlborough, and a Maori cultural show with the lighting just right. That is the version everyone agrees on. That is the version that sells. But scattered across both islands, there are structures nobody can fully agree on. Not myths, not campfire stories. Actual stone, actual tunnels, actual earthworks that geologists, archaeologists, historians, and the descendants of the people who built them still argue about. Some of the arguments are about who built them. Some are about why. A few are about whether they were built at all, or whether the land itself just decided to look like something it is not. Today, 13 of them. Go on, subscribe, and I will tell you the whole story. Number 13. The Kaimanawa Wall, sitting deep in the Kaimanawa Forest Park, on the central plateau of the North Island, a few hours' walk from the nearest road. What you find there is a face of columnar basalt rock, roughly cut into what looks, from certain angles, disturbingly like a masonry wall. Straight lines, right angles, a surface that appears dressed rather than eroded. When a hunter first photographed it properly in the mid-1990s, the image circulated fast, and alternative researchers declared it evidence of a lost civilization that predated Maori settlement by thousands of years. Geologists from GNS Science went out, took samples, and came back with a much less dramatic answer. Columnar jointing, a completely natural process where cooling volcanic rock fractures into geometric columns, the same process behind the Giant's Causeway in Ireland and the Devil's Post Pile in California. The official position is that this is geology, not archaeology, and yet the site still draws people willing to walk for hours through forest with no track, just to stand in front of it and decide for themselves. The Department of Conservation has never fenced it off or marked it in any official capacity. It simply sits there, doing what basalt does when it cools slowly, looking for all the world like something somebody built on purpose. Whether that resemblance is coincidence or something science has not fully accounted for is a question the rock itself has no interest in answering. The rock face itself measures roughly 30 meters across and stands about 4 meters high at its tallest point. And what makes it so convincing at first glance is the way the columns have fractured horizontally as well as vertically, creating what looks like coursed masonry rather than raw stone. Add to that the fact the site sits nowhere near a road, nowhere near a river people would have travelled by, in forest that offers no obvious reason for anyone, ancient or modern, to build there on purpose. And you start to understand why it has kept generating theories for 30 years running, long after the geologists said their piece and moved on to other work. There is something almost funny about a country arguing over a wall in the middle of nowhere that nobody actually needed. But if that one unsettles you, wait until we get to the tunnels. Number 12. Kawau Island, an hour and a half north of Auckland by boat, home to Mansion House, the elegant 19th century residence built by Sir George Grey, twice Governor of New Zealand. Beneath and around that mansion runs a network of tunnels and shafts left over from the Kawau copper mine, which operated in the 1840s and 50s before Grey bought the island and turned it into his private retreat. Officially, the tunnels were mining infrastructure, plain and simple, dug by Cornish miners chasing copper ore that turned out to be less profitable than hoped. But locals on the island, and more than a few historians who have spent time in the archive at Auckland Museum, point out that several of the tunnel entrances do not line up with any known ore seam, and that at least 2 of them appear to connect directly toward the old wharf, in a way that would have made sense for moving something quickly and quietly rather than hauling copper. Grey himself was a controversial figure, a man who accumulated an extraordinary personal library and an even more extraordinary reputation for secrecy. Some researchers have floated the idea that portions of the tunnel network were repurposed, or perhaps built from the start, for storage that had nothing to do with mining. The Department of Conservation, which now manages the island as a scenic reserve, has sealed several of the shafts for safety reasons. which has done nothing to quiet the speculation. A man who worked as a ranger on Kawau for 11 years told an Auckland newspaper in 2009 that he had personally found sections of the tunnels that were not on any historical mining survey he had ever seen. Whether that is an administrative gap or something else, nobody in any official capacity has ever given a satisfactory answer. Gray's own biographers note that he was a man who kept two entirely separate sets of correspondence for much of his career, one for public consumption and one he burned selectively before his death in 1898, which does nothing to settle the question and everything to keep it alive. Visitors today can walk a marked heritage trail past several of the sealed shaft entrances, each fitted with a simple grille rather than a full concrete cap. Close enough that you can stand at the opening, feel the cold air moving up from somewhere below, and understand exactly why the rumours never really stopped. Number 11. The Waitomo Caves, world famous for their glowworms, less famous for the markings some visitors and researchers claim to have found deep in the unlit sections, far past the tourist boardwalks. Waitomo is a limestone cave system carved by water over roughly 30 million years, and the vast majority of it has never been mapped, let alone open to the public. In the 1970s, a caving expedition working in an unlit chamber reported finding what looked like deliberate scratch marks and possible carved symbols on a wall roughly 40 meters below the surface, in a section that would have required specialized equipment to reach even today. Photographs from that expedition are held, somewhat inconveniently, in a private collection rather than a public archive, which has made independent verification difficult. Heritage New Zealand has stated that no confirmed pre-European carvings have been formally recorded at Waitomo, and mainstream archaeology treats the 70s photographs as unverified pending better documentation. Local iwi with whakapapa connections to the caves have their own oral histories about the deeper chambers, stories about the cave system extending far beyond where any modern survey has gone, used in the past for purposes that were never meant to be casual. Those histories are treated with the seriousness they deserve, not as folklore to be picked apart for tourist content. The caves themselves keep expanding on paper every few years as new chambers are surveyed. Whatever is down in the dark, unlit sections, the honest answer is that almost nobody currently alive has actually seen it. The publicly toured sections of Waitomo, the Glowworm Grotto and the Ruakuri and Aranui systems, represent a small fraction of a limestone network geologists estimate could run for well over 45 kilometres in total. Most of it unsurveyed even now, in an age when satellite mapping can locate a single sheep in a paddock from orbit. Caving clubs from Hamilton and Auckland still run periodic expeditions into the unmapped sections under strict permit conditions, and every few years one of them comes back with a report of a chamber, a passage, or a marking that nobody had catalogued before, which is either a sign of how much is still down there, or a sign of how much depends entirely on who happens to be holding the torch. Number 10. The Boulder Bank, a 4.5 kilometre long, perfectly straight ridge of grey boulders running along the coast just outside Nelson, protecting the harbour like a breakwater a civil engineer might have designed. For over a century, sailors and visitors arriving at Nelson by sea assumed it was artificial, a seawall built by early settlers or, in more imaginative tellings, by a much older population. It is not. Geologists have traced its formation to erosion at Glendowen, roughly 13 kilometres up the coast, where andesite rock breaks off the cliffs and is carried south by longshore drift, depositing boulder by boulder over an estimated 13,000 years into the exact straight formation you see today. It is one of only 2 boulder banks of its kind in the world. The official explanation is settled, published, and about as solid as geology gets. What keeps the Boulder Bank on lists like this one is not scientific doubt. It is the plain fact that 13,000 years of ocean current built something that looks more deliberate, more engineered, more human than most things people actually build on purpose. Standing on it, walking its full length as some locals do for exercise, it is hard to shake the feeling that nature made a decision here, and that the decision looked a great deal like intention. Early European surveyors in the 1840s genuinely debated whether the ridge should be classified as a coastal defence structure left by an earlier population, and it took proper geological survey work later in the century to settle the matter once and for all. A small lighthouse now stands at the northern tip, built in 1862 and still operating, a piece of unmistakably human engineering sitting at the end of 4.5 kilometres of engineering that nobody built at all. Number 9. Bruce Bay, a remote stretch of the west coast of the South Island, where in 1886 a farmer clearing land found a corroded iron object buried beneath tree roots that had grown around it. It was later identified by museum staff as a piece of Spanish Mauryan helmet, a style of armour used by European soldiers and sailors in the 1500s, more than a century and a half before James Cook charted New Zealand's coastline in 1769. The helmet fragment is real. It sat in storage at the Hokitika Museum for decades and has been examined multiple times. The official position from most historians is caution rather than denial. The object could plausibly have arrived through later trade, salvage from a wreck of unknown origin, or even as a curiosity brought ashore long after its manufacture, rather than proof of an early Spanish landing. But the theory of a lost Spanish or Portuguese expedition reaching New Zealand before Cook, sometimes called the ancient mariners' theory, has never fully gone away, partly because Bruce Bay is not the only piece of circumstantial evidence pointing that direction, and partly because the west coast in the 16th century would have been an entirely plausible place for a storm-blown ship to run aground and never be heard from again. No wreck has ever been found nearby to confirm it. The helmet fragment remains the strongest physical clue anyone has, sitting in a display case, offering no further explanation of how it got there. Supporters of the ancient mariners' theory point to old Maori accounts, recorded by early ethnographers, of pale-skinned strangers arriving by sea generations before Cook, and to a handful of other West Coast finds over the decades, an old cannon reportedly seen embedded in coastal rock and later lost again, a scrap of chainmail some collectors claim to have handled and then misplaced, none of it as solid as the Bruce Bay helmet, all of it circling the same unanswered question. Mainstream historians are quick to point out that absence of a shipwreck is not a small gap. It is the whole case, and that a single corroded helmet fragment, however genuine, cannot on its own rewrite the accepted timeline of European contact with this country. Number 8. Wairau Bar, at the mouth of the Wairau River near Blenheim, is the single most important early archaeological site in New Zealand, and one of the most argued over. Excavated seriously beginning in the 1940s, and again with far more careful, iwi-led methodology from 2009 onward, Wairau Bar preserved the remains of an early moa hunting community, along with adzes, fishhooks and ornaments consistent with East Polynesian voyaging culture. Radiocarbon dating from the site has been central to establishing when Polynesian settlers first arrived in New Zealand, with estimates that have shifted more than once as testing methods improved, moving the accepted settlement window earlier by centuries compared to what textbooks said 50 years ago. That alone tells you how unsettled the science still is. In 2009, Rangitane o Wairau, the iwi with direct Wakapapa connection to the site, took the extraordinary step of having the remains of 42 ancestors, excavated decades earlier and held by Canterbury Museum, returned and reburied with full ceremony, asserting rightful authority over how their own history is studied and told. That decision is respected here, without question. What Wairau Bar still leaves genuinely open is the finer detail of exactly how early, how organised, and how connected to the wider Pacific those first voyaging communities were. The bones, the tools, and the middens keep answering some questions while quietly raising new ones. Isotope analysis carried out on the returned remains before reburial suggested that at least a handful of the individuals buried at Wairau Bar had spent their early childhood somewhere other than New Zealand, likely tropical East Polynesia, meaning some of the very first generation to call this country home had crossed thousands of kilometres of open ocean as children and lived out their adult lives and eventually their deaths on a gravel bar at the edge of a river they had no ancestral memory of at all. That single detail, more than any wall or tunnel on this list, is the kind of fact that makes the scale of the original voyaging achievement genuinely hard to sit with. Number 7. In the far north, in the depths of Waipoua forest, home to Taine Mahuta, the largest living kauri tree in the country, a series of stone formations were documented and photographed by amateur researcher Noel Hilliam, beginning in the 1990s. Hilliam described what he called an ancient walled city, complete with what he interpreted as foundation lines, a possible astronomical observation platform, and stone arrangements he believed predated Maori settlement by a considerable margin. His claims received attention from alternative history circles internationally and were the subject of at least one documentary. Mainstream archaeologists who examined the same formations concluded they were consistent with natural rock outcropping and, in some cases, later agricultural clearance activity, and no peer-reviewed excavation has ever supported the ancient city interpretation. Northland iwi have been notably firm on this point, stating publicly that claims of a pre-Maori civilization in Waipoua have no basis in the documented history or whakapapa of the region, and that such theories, however well-intentioned, risk displacing Maori history rather than adding to it. That context matters, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. What remains true is that Waipoua forest is genuinely ancient, genuinely full of formations that look engineered under the right light, and genuinely a place where the difference between what the land is and what a person wants it to be has never been fully settled to everyone's satisfaction. Taine Mahuta itself, standing not far from the disputed stone formations, is estimated to be somewhere between 1,200 and 2,500 years old. A single living tree that predates every theory anyone has ever proposed about the forest around it, and it asks for none of the argument that its stone neighbours have generated. Some things in Waipoua do not need to be explained, they only need to be respected. If you have made it this far, you already know the pattern. Every one of these places has an official answer and an unofficial hum underneath it that refuses to fully go quiet. Subscribe to show that these videos actually help and that they make sense. It costs nothing, and it tells me the work is landing the way I hope it does. Number 6. Ruapekapeka Pa, in Northland, is not a mystery in the sense of the unexplained. It is a mystery in the sense of being underestimated for far too long. Built in 1845 by Ngapuhi under the direction of Kawiti during the Northern War, Ruapekapeka Pa was, by any honest modern military assessment, one of the most sophisticated fortifications built anywhere in the world at that point in the 19th century. It featured a network of underground bunkers and connecting tunnels engineered specifically to withstand direct cannon fire from British artillery, trench systems that anticipated tactics not formally adopted by European armies until the trench warfare of the First World War, some 70 years later. British forces eventually took the PAA, but only after Kawiti's forces had already largely withdrawn, and the military value of what they captured was, by their own officers' later accounts, disappointingly hollow. For over a century, the significance of Ruapekapeka's engineering was underplayed in mainstream New Zealand histories, treated as a footnote to a colonial military victory, rather than what it actually was, a masterclass in defensive architecture built without any European training, using knowledge developed independently on this side of the world. Heritage New Zealand and the Department of Conservation have since restored and properly interpreted the site, and modern military historians now cite Ruapekapeka in serious academic discussion of pre-industrial fortification design. The tunnels you can walk through today are real, measured, and understood. What is still being reckoned with is how long it took the official record to admit how far ahead of its time they were. British officers on the ground in 1846 wrote home describing defences unlike anything they had encountered in any prior campaign. Trench lines angled specifically to break the force of cannon fire. Firing positions dug low enough that defenders could reload in complete safety, and yet those same observations sat largely unread in regimental archives for well over 100 years, while New Zealand school textbooks described the battle in a single paragraph. It took modern battlefield archaeology, using ground-penetrating radar in the 2010s, to finally map the full extent of the tunnel network and confirm just how extensive Kawiti's engineering really was. Number 5. Maungakiekie, known to most Aucklanders as One Tree Hill, rises out of the middle of the city as an extinct volcanic cone terraced with rings of ancient earthworks and pockmarked with deep, perfectly circular pits. Those pits are Kumara storage pits, part of what was, before European contact, the largest and most heavily fortified PA in the country, home at its peak to an estimated several thousand people. What continues to generate genuine academic debate is not whether the PAI existed, that is beyond question, but the precise population figures, the internal social organization implied by the scale of the terracing, and how a settlement of that density managed food storage, water in defense on a volcanic cone with no natural water source of its own. Some archaeologists argue the population estimates commonly cited are too high, based on outdated methods of extrapolating from pit density. Others argue they are roughly right, and that Maungakiekie represented a level of urban planning that most people, looking at a grassy hill with sheep on it today, would never guess was there. The famous single totara tree that gave the hill its English name was cut down by an activist in 1999 in protest at its colonial associations, and the summit today carries a specifically designed obelisk and a stand of native trees planted in 2016 after years of consultation with the 13 iwi and hapu who hold mana wenua over the maunga. Beneath the grass, the storage pits are still there, silent, still occasionally excavated a little further, still telling archaeologists things about pre-European Auckland that the city built on top of it has mostly forgotten to ask about. Aerial laser scanning conducted across the wider Auckland volcanic field in recent years has revealed that Maungakiekie was only the largest node in a much bigger network of interconnected PA sitting across nearly all of the city's volcanic cones, meaning modern Auckland, with its motorways and apartment towers, was built directly on top of what was, 800 years ago, one of the most densely fortified urban landscapes anywhere in the Pacific. Number 4. Along the far northern coastline near Cape Reinga, in an area regarded by Maori as sacred, there exist burial caves and Waitomo sites, whose precise locations have never been publicly mapped and never will be, by deliberate and entirely appropriate choice. This is a place where the official silence is not an information gap to be solved. It is a boundary that exists for good reason, maintained by the iwi and hapu of the far north as an act of kaitiakitanga, guardianship over the resting places of their ancestors. What can be said, respectfully and without detail, that would compromise that protection is that Cape Reinga itself, known in Te Reo Maori as Te Reinga Wairau, the leaping place of spirits, is understood in Maori tradition as the point from which the spirits of the dead depart, journeying along the roots of an 800-year-old pohutukawa tree that clings to the cliff edge before returning to Hawaii. This is not folklore presented for entertainment. It is a living spiritual framework held with the same seriousness any faith tradition deserves. The caves and sites near the Cape have never been excavated, catalogued, or opened for research, and Heritage New Zealand's own guidance explicitly supports IWE authority over whether and how such sites are ever studied. Whether the modern instinct to demand full documentation of every place in the country is itself a kind of cultural blindness is a question worth sitting with longer than most viewers of a video like this one usually do. Number 3. The Moeraki Boulders, scattered across a beach south of Oamaru on the Otago coast, are near spherical stones, some over 2 meters across, that look for all the world like giant cannonballs or dinosaur eggs left behind on the sand. Geologically, they are septarian concretions, formed over roughly 4 million years as minerals crystallized around a core deep in ancient mudstone, later exposed as the surrounding softer rock eroded away, a process fully explained and accepted by geologists worldwide. In Maori tradition, they are explained differently and just as completely, as kumara, calabashes and eel baskets washed ashore from the wreck of the Araitiuru canoe, one of the great ancestral voyaging canoes with nearby rock formations identified as the canoe's hull. and the ship's navigator turned to stone on the hillside above. Both explanations are complete on their own terms. Neither one needs the other to be wrong. What tends to get lost in tourist descriptions of the boulders is that presenting the geology as the real answer and the Maori tradition as decoration is itself a kind of quiet disrespect, treating one knowledge system as fact and the other as story, when both are simply different, equally valid ways a people has made sense of the same extraordinary stones on the same extraordinary beach. Some of the larger boulders have cracked open naturally over time, revealing intricate networks of calcite veins inside that look, when photographed properly, almost like something between coral and a turtle shell, a detail that only deepens the impression that these stones were made rather than merely formed. Erosion continues to expose new boulders along the same stretch of coast every few years, which means the beach today looks slightly different than it did when your grandparents might have walked it, and will look different again for whoever walks it next. If you have been to any of these places and noticed something I have not mentioned here, I would genuinely like to know. Leave it in the comments because I read every one of them. Number 2. Motutapu Island, a short ferry ride from downtown Auckland, sitting quietly beside its much more famous volcanic neighbour, Rangitoto, holds one of the most extensive and least visited networks of underground fortification in the entire Pacific. Built during the Second World War as part of Auckland's coastal defence against a feared Japanese invasion that, in the event, never came. Motutapu's tunnel system includes gun emplacements, plotting rooms, magazines and barracks, much of it dug directly into the volcanic rock by New Zealand Army engineers between 1942 and 1943. Officially, the tunnels are a heritage site, partially restored, open to visitors on specific tour days, run by volunteers from the Motutapu Restoration Trust. What still unsettles people who actually walk them is scale. Sections of the network extend far beyond what any public map shows, connecting gun positions that, from the surface, look completely unrelated to one another. Veterans interviewed decades later described sealed-off sections that were never fully documented once the war ended, and the urgency that built them evaporated overnight. A place built with total wartime seriousness designed to withstand an invasion that arrived only as fear and never as fact. Sitting now mostly empty, mostly dark, a few hundred meters from a beach where families have picnics on a Sunday afternoon. Roughly 3,000 soldiers were stationed across Motutapu and neighbouring Rangitoto at the height of the war, a population larger than most New Zealand towns at the time, living inside a volcanic island that today carries a permanent population of essentially nobody, just a handful of Department of Conservation staff and the volunteers who keep the old barracks from collapsing entirely into the bush that has spent 80 years quietly trying to take the tunnels back. Number 1. On the 10th of June, 1886, Mount Tarawera erupted with a force that reshaped the landscape of the central North Island in a matter of hours, killing well over 100 people and burying, beneath meters of ash and mud, the pink and white terraces, a pair of silica formations on the shores of Lake Rotomahana that had been, before that night, considered by many 19th century travellers the eighth wonder of the natural world. Cascading tiers of pink and white mineral rock, warm pools stepping down toward the lake, a site sacred to local Maori, and a magnet for wealthy tourists from as far as Europe. After the eruption, the terraces were assumed destroyed outright, and for well over a century, that was the accepted, uncontested history. Then, beginning in the 2010, competing scientific teams began finding evidence suggesting sections of the terraces might have survived, buried but largely intact, beneath the new lake bed created by the eruption. In 2011, one research group announced they had located the lower terrace formation using ground-penetrating survey data. Other geologists disputed the interpretation entirely, arguing the data showed nothing more than natural terrain features consistent with the eruption's blast pattern. The argument has continued in academic journals for over a decade since, with new expeditions launched, new sonar data gathered, and no single conclusion agreed upon by everyone involved. Local iwi, whose ancestors lived beside the terraces and lost people in the eruption, have their own perspective on the search, some welcoming the possibility of the taonga being rediscovered, others more cautious about disturbing a site that is also, quietly, a grave. Somewhere beneath Lake Rotomahana, in the dark and the silt, something is down there. Whether it is the eighth wonder of the world waiting to be uncovered, or simply rock behaving exactly as rock behaves after a mountain tears itself apart, remains, after more than a decade of genuinely serious science, still completely unresolved. Survivors' accounts from the night of the eruption describe a sky-lit orange from horizon to horizon and a sound heard clearly in Christchurch, over 800 kilometres to the south. And it is worth remembering, in among all the geological argument, that the terraces were never simply scenery. They were, and in Maori tradition remain, a taonga connected to Te Arawa, a place of genuine spiritual and historical weight, buried in a single catastrophic night alongside villages and lives that the terraces themselves have somewhat overshadowed in the popular telling ever since. 13 structures, 2 islands, a wall that might be nothing more than cooling lava, and a wartime tunnel network built to fight an invasion that never landed, and somewhere in between, a lost natural wonder that an entire country still cannot agree is actually lost. What strikes me, going through all of this again for you, is how little any of it has to do with certainty, and how much it has to do with what people are willing to sit with not knowing. This country likes to present itself as simple: green hills, clean rivers, straightforward history. But every one of these places, whether it is stone or basalt or silica or tunnel, holds the same quiet argument at its core between what science can prove, what a community remembers, and what the land itself seems to be telling anyone patient enough to stand in front of it and listen. None of these 13 places asked to be a mystery. People did that. The land just kept doing what land does, long before anyone showed up with a camera or a shovel or a theory, and it will keep doing it long after all of us have stopped arguing about it. I am a grandpa, and grandpas worry. Look after yourself.